I am Brandy Coons. I'm the curator at the Firehouse Art Center, here using our official account, which is in our director, Elaine Waterman's name. So I'm Brandy. So, don't go after her if I say something. Thanks for joining us. We have a panel in response to some specific issues that we encountered in preparing our month of photography exhibit this year. I decided I wanted to, through fine art, just provide kind of a spatial synopsis of some of the major issues that faced us in 2020. So we tried to cover work related to the pandemic, wildlife management, the wildfires, and the massive protests and sort of civil unrest that occurred in the spring and summer of 2020. And so in that direction, I invited Nolan Septer and Armando Geneyro to exhibit work. And we had some back and forth on which images would be shown. And so we thought, let's talk about that. Let's talk about why. Let's talk about how we react to these issues in photography. And so we've put together this panel. And so just to introduce everyone, I'm going to read our bios about our people. To bring additional perspective and expertise to the panel, we have Angie Chuang, who is an associate professor of journalism at CU Boulder. Her work and research and teaching focus on race, identity, and representations of otherness after 13 years as a national and regional award-winning newspaper reporter all over the country. So your work specifically focuses on diversity in journalism and reporting in media, and that's fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us. And we have Caroline Kert, who is a senior attorney at Creative Legal LLC. She has served as a director and president of, I cannot pronounce that.
Apogaea.
Apogaea, a local nonprofit arts organization associated with Burning Man. She currently serves as Burning Man's Boulder Regional Contact and is a board member of the Boulder Fringe Festival, and was most recently named as the Colorado Attorneys for the Arts Volunteer Lawyer of the Year. Thank you for volunteering your time with us.
You're welcome.
And we also have the two photographers from our exhibit documenting the protests in Denver last year, Armando and Nolan. Armando Geneyro, am I saying that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Is a photographer based in Denver and California. Geneyro is a co-founder of They Shootin', a collective of photographers and videographers. And as a group, they have hosted several visual-based events, including Winter in America, an exhibit series that brings photography and philanthropy together to speak on topics such as homelessness, drug abuse, and domestic violence from the viewpoint of new up-and-coming artists. And Nolan Septer, wave. Nolan, hey, thanks. Studied photography at Colorado Mountain College. He has exhibited his work in numerous group shows in Colorado, Minnesota, and New York. An image from his series documenting protests in Denver following the death of George Floyd was displayed at the International Center of Photography in New York in their show ICP Concerned, Global Images for Global Crisis. So those are everyone's bios. Let's admit another person. And let's see. So yeah, I said our exhibit, I was looking at Nolan and Armando's websites, and I was really, really drawn to some of the more kind of personal images of people. And both of you guys at some point were like, I don't feel comfortable showing and printing that image. And even Nolan was like, I don't want to put a price on these images. I don't want to make them for sale. That feels wrong. And so if we can, maybe the next step that we do is we start by looking at your work. If we want to start with Nolan, if you have your, like you said, you have your website prepped, we can kind of screen share and look at some of those images.
Yeah, okay.
Cool.
I've never really done this. I don't know how to
Oh, there's a button at the bottom that's green.
Oh, yep, I see that. All right.
See it.
Great. Yeah, it
All
looks
right.
good.
So how do I get over there?
So tell us about maybe when you took these photographs and what your motivation was in showing up to document what was happening.
Yeah, so the first day I went there was May 29th. I believe that was like 3 or 4 days after George Floyd died in Minnesota. But yeah, I don't know. I was seeing people's videos on Instagram, and I just wanted to go down there and see it with my own eyes. It looked kind of crazy. I saw people getting shot with the tear gas and the rubber bullets and all that stuff, and it just seemed surprising. I wanted to see it with my own eyes, and so yeah, I just brought my camera with me because it's what I like to do. So yeah, just wanted to document and see it. But yeah, I went there over the course of a week. I went there about 5 days or so, from the 29th to the 3rd of June.
Did you go with a group of any kind? Did you have like a...
No, well, one day I did go with a couple of friends, but
Yeah.
the other days, no, it was just solo. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I don't know if you guys heard that story about Russell Strong, I think was his name. He lost his eye from a
Yeah.
rubber bullet. Yeah, this is actually him right there.
Wow.
This is right as that happened. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah, those are all the 20. Oh, that's just the 30th now. May 30th. But yeah, after those first 2 days I was there, then starting on the first, the cops kind of started to back off a little bit and let the people kind of gather without them being so close. And then there really wasn't much of that. There wasn't any more of the tear gas or rubber bullets from that point out, really. So yeah, I got a lot more peaceful after those first few days. And there's a lot of speakers that came and were talking, and yeah, just people were just listening to what they had to say, and a lot of marches and whatnot, like stuff like that. But yeah, that was basically it. Yeah. And this is the last of it right here. When they ended up outside of the police station on Colfax. So. But yeah, that was it.
Mm. Great photographs.
Yeah, thank you. Casual transition.
Right.
Let's look at Armando's photos too. We'll have question and answer at the end. And because I was really hoping the general format of this would be largely conversational. I know our two experts in journalism and the law have some slides to present, but we also want to allow for questions and a kind of a conversational transition. So if you are watching the panel and you do have questions, there is a chat. If you type them in, I've got my eye on that. So we'll address those, but do an official question and answer at the end. So just to transition, let's check out Armando. Do you want to share your screen?
Sure, yeah. says I cannot.
I think
start
Nolan needs to
screen
stop
sharing.
sharing.
Oh,
So
how do
just
I
close the browser tab.
Oh no,
Once you
is
do
it, or
Does
is
that-
it options? Maybe
let me see here.
there should. There might be a little arrow, a tiny arrow next to the big share screen arrow at the bottom that gives you options.
All right, let me see here. Yeah, I'm not seeing that bottom section anymore. I don't know how to get there.
Oh, hit escape. Did that minimize anything?
If you
No.
hover your mouse over the top of your screen, it should give you an option to stop sharing.
Oh, yeah, I see that.
Aha,
There we go.
Angie, thank you. Okay, so Armando, take it away.
Yeah. Okay. So this is my website. Is it working?
Not yet.
Let's see.
Click that share.
Okay.
screen. There we go.
Yeah, there we go.
All right. This is my email. So I don't want that. Let's see. All right. Is it working now?
Mhm.
Okay. All right. So here's one of I have all my Denver work split up into different chapters in my website. So this one is kind of covering a lot of the events of last summer as far as the different protests. Yeah, I mean, most of it is from the first couple of weeks. I think my first day out there was the third, I guess 3 days after George Floyd died. So I think it was like May 28th. It started off at the Capitol and kind of ended up winding through downtown, and then ended up dispersing after that. And then over the next 2 nights, over the weekend, it got really like inflamed. There was a lot of, there was a lot of confrontations with the police. And then, like Nolan said, over the next few days after that, it got a little bit more peaceful. There wasn't as many confrontations with the police as there was in the first few days. And so I just tried to go down there and cover as much as I could. Ultimately, like when I go down and I cover a protest, I'm trying to cover it from a few different perspectives. The first is that of a journalist. I'm a freelancer, so I try to record for history's sake the events that are happening, for the people that aren't here, so they can see what's going on here. It's part of our city and state's history. I'm also coming at it from the perspective of an artist. I'm trying to tell a story through an image while also making it visually appealing. And ultimately, I'm going there as a protester myself because a lot of the stuff that I cover is stuff that I tend to agree with or tend to support. That's why you'll never see me at a pro-Trump rally, or last year when there was a lot of people protesting the mask and mandate and the lockdown. I didn't go to those protests with people saying, we're tired of wearing these masks. You'll definitely find me at a pro Black Lives Matter protest, or if there's a protest immediately following the police killing of a civilian. You'll see me at Stop an Asian Hate, Asian American Hate protest. So ultimately, I'm trying to, when I share these photos, this is a way of me activating my free speech and kind of expanding on the feelings of the protesters as well as my own, and trying to give voice to the way I feel about the world and the way the hunt for the search for justice, if you will. So yeah, a lot of these. Now that I'm actually at this one, This was during a protest after the killing of William DeBose. He was a young Black man that was gunned down actually right outside my apartment on May 1st of last year, 3.5 weeks before the actual event, the situation with George Floyd. And so, I was already coming off that experience 3 weeks prior to the George Floyd killing. I was already coming off my own experience where I saw outside my window and my balcony a young man that was killed by the police here in Denver. So, we kind of during the kind of the protest that arose from the George Floyd killing, it kind of activated us as a community here in Denver, and we moved to try to get a lot of the police cam, the body cam footage, try to get that released from DPD to see if to see what really happened to William. And so again, that's all part of the way. When I go to a protest, I'm an active participant. I'm also trying to capture it as an outsider looking in. So there's a couple artists that did a George Floyd mural here in Denver. And a lot of these photos too are from different, there was a lot of protests last summer concerning the jailing of migrant children at the ICE facilities in Aurora. We were there supporting that movement, trying to, advocate for a lot of those immigrant children that were, being locked up. Last summer was really active. Last summer was super active here in Denver. I mean, I think a lot of people were kind of getting, cabin fever, from being locked up, over the spring in their homes. And when we saw the killing of George Floyd, it just kind of activated that movement and made us feel like we needed to go out and voice our concerns. As a community, Black and brown together.
When we talked about when I reached out to you to ask if you'd be interested in joining our exhibit with work, and one of the things that I found really compelling in your work is that a lot of the images focus on the protest as an expression of community. Like you photograph street vendors, you photograph people smiling, as much as there is like a violent confrontation with police. And I found that really interesting and kind of particular to, I think, the current movement, because we think a lot about like the history of photographing protests and social movements. And I think people kind of get this attachment to the idea and on purpose for some historical figures that the violence is the most important thing to convey because it grabs people. But I think in a contemporary story about these protests, the idea that they're also expressions of community and solidarity.
Right. Yeah.
Really
And that is definitely important to show that too, because I don't think that's shown a lot in the the mainstream media, like your Channel 9 News, your local TV stations. It's those, like you said, those images of violence and confrontation that really grabs people's attention. And ultimately, news outlets are businesses, and so they're trying to get eyes on their channel. But it's important to show images like I think like this one, where the community is surrounding these musicians, and they're really trying to uplift the spirit of that night in particular. Or even with these young ladies right here, they're really, it's the joy. And it, when you bring those people together, you can see that joy, and it's all about, not just showing that violence and confrontation and the negative parts of a protest, but also capturing, that feeling of community and joy and hope.
And I do think that kind of relates back to the larger, a little bit, the picture that we're going to be asking Caroline and Angie about, which is, or maybe more Angie, because it's her specialty is presenting stories, but, has in journalism, that attitude about documenting events changed in any way? And hopefully I'll get an answer to that question. I have so many questions for you guys. So yeah, thank you so much for sharing. And thanks to you both for being willing to print and share images for our exhibit. I think it was really powerful. Thanks, you guys.
Yeah, how was the turnout? People come by, or?
It was about as expected. I mean, I feel like our expectations are what they are right now, but
there was like a huge storm that weekend.
I know.
For the opening, yeah, we were open for like Saturdays, just like the door was open so people could come in, but I feel like that's affected a little bit by the number of people who happen to be out and about too, and it was cold. But we did have a lot of positive response from people who did interact with the show, and that's a win. People come in, they interact. And plus now it gives us a chance to have this conversation, which I feel like, I can't wait to hear what everybody dives into. So the next person on my order of ops list is Angie Chuang. Angie, as a journalist approaching something really sensitive, like, okay, so you have a presentation prepared, but I definitely wanted to kind of throw some brief, like, this is what I'm wondering. Like, everybody now is so worried about having.
I'll delay my screen share while we talk.
Oh, okay. I'm so sorry. Everybody's so
no, it's okay.
Like being recognizable in photographs at protests, and I know that connects to Caroline as well, but in particular to Caroline. But as far as a journalist telling a story, tell us about like how. Yes, your presentation is, how do you go about telling this story in a way that's ethical and accurate? And what are your points?
Yeah. So for those who recognized it, I gave a glimpse of my case study, which is about a protest at Northwestern University that led to all the questions that you're asking tonight about what it means to be recognizably photographed in a protest, what it means to have a reporter either try to name you or identify you or interview you about actions at a protest, and what it means to be photographed in a moment that either might be traumatic if there's police violence, or might have either professional or other consequences going forward, depending on the politics of the protests or those who might oppose the protests. And I think another kind of extreme opposite example would be the insurrection at the Capitol, and how all law enforcement is essentially based on social media posts and images. And so we see a situation in a very different kind of riot insurrection, where the photography, primarily on social media, but also on news media, is being used as a tool of law enforcement. And I think had that been turned upon a Black Lives Matter protest, that would have definitely generated outrage and really created backlash against either the journalists or photographers who had taken those photos. And so that's all kind of in the air now. And I think we're just in a different era of use and awareness of imageries, of people constantly being photographed and videotaped all the time, and it appearing in so many different forums, and that a photograph taken in Denver can instantly be all over the world in a way it couldn't even 10 years ago. And so these are all, and then journalism is sort of at this really critical hinge point, where we see a generation of mainstream legacy media journalists who are still very insistent on the objective journalism model. And this summer, particularly with Black Lives Matter, you saw a younger generation of largely journalists of color who really resisted that and said, you know, I can't be neutral in a protest because, one, my identity instantly has made this experience for me one of complete non-neutrality, and that my experience of police brutality is not neutral because of the identity I live and cannot shed just because I put on a press pass. And also that in the era of Trump, journalists were not treated or viewed as neutral entities in a protest. They were targeted, they were doxxed, they were threatened. Many of them were injured, and quite gravely. And it just became this sort of era when it wasn't like if you were identified as press, people, both either participants or law enforcement would sort of give you birth to do your job. That no longer happens. And so journalists literally became not neutral. And so there aren't easy answers. I think everybody's debating this right now, and newsrooms are very, very divided over this. Even what a journalist can say on Twitter during a protest and what is considered biased or not biased. And so there's so many cases of reporters, many of them young, many of them BIPOC, who were reprimanded, fired, punished for actions that I think a younger generation of people saw as just participating in the discourse. And so I don't, like I said, I don't have like the answer to, therefore this is like the ethical way to go about it, but just to say that we're at this very dynamic point in the debate. And I think that the younger generation of journalists are really going to drive it as we see basically a change in leadership in mainstream news media. So I can talk about my case study a bit because I think it highlights some of these topics. And I'd love to hear what Armando and Nolan have to say about their feeling of both being a participant documenter, right? Especially, you know, Armando was saying that's really important to him, as well as documenting some of the more difficult, traumatic, and sensitive moments of a protest. So I'm sure we'll get to talk about that in the discussion. So the case study I just wanted to bring up happened in November 2019. So before the pandemic, before the summer's Black Lives Matter protests. And it was a speech by Jeff Sessions, then Attorney General under Trump at Northwestern University. And he was largely being blamed for, I think rightfully so, for the policies at the border with the separation of the children and the detention of the children, as well as policies around DACA that were unfriendly to undocumented students. So there was a student protest, and the Daily Northwestern photographed and covered it. Here are some of the images they ran from the protest. And some of the protests happened indoors at the lecture hall, like this one where Sessions was speaking, and some of it spilled out onto the campus. Here's another one just outside the lecture hall. And the protests got violent. The police cracked down on the students, and there was some rough treatment of the protesters. As the story was being reported, there was really vehement resistance among the student protesters for having their images out there, being contacted by reporters, often through the student directory, which felt intrusive, and the feeling that that they were being endangered by and re-traumatized by having the images out there. So the editor of the Daily Northwestern, or the group of editors, published an apology that contained these statements about their actions being hurtful. And this completely incensed professional journalists at publications ranging from the Chicago Tribune to the Washington Post to the New York Times, and just like within hours of this apology coming out, this storm of tweets of largely male, white, I would say Gen X to Boomer journalists, just completely outraged that the Daily Northwestern would dare apologize for their actions around the protest. And so you can kind of see, why are they apologizing for the basics of reporting? This is an embarrassment. Why are they apologizing for the sin of committing journalism? It is an appalling ignorance of the basics of news gathering, and just the sort of like really harsh criticism of the students' actions. I think it's also difficult to ignore the racial dynamics of what happened at Northwestern. The majority of the student protesters were Black, Indigenous, people of color students. The Daily Northwestern's lead editor was African American, but the majority of the staff and prior editors had been white. And so even in the apology, the editor did discuss that as a historically white institution, we have a particular positionality and responsibility towards students from marginalized groups, and that is part of the dynamic. And that was seen as political correctness or Gen Z being too sensitive, and they were suddenly like these sensitive snowflakes that couldn't handle having a protest covered. That was sort of the narrative that emerged. So I just want to review, and then I would love to just discuss this more. I don't want to come to like dramatic conclusions about, you could probably tell by the tone of how I'm describing it, where I stand on this. But the Society of Professional Journalists, which is considered the flagship organization for professional journalists, in their code of ethics, they have 4 core principles. And I think it's important to point out that the 4 core principles often are in conflict with each other. And so if you seek truth and report it, but minimize harm, there comes a point when the truth can be harmful. And so how do you balance seeking truth and minimizing harm? Acting independently. Again, you want to be not beholden to the organizations or institutions that you cover, so you can independently criticize them. But how does a student of color covering an event act independently from, say, the question of police brutality or Black Lives Matter, if they themselves might be subject to it? And that was the question that's happening at a lot of newsrooms now. And accountable and transparent. And so I think that the Northwestern Daily was accountable and transparent when they reacted to the criticism they received. And we could debate exactly how they reacted. But I also think the other thing that we have to consider that is also relevant to Nolan and Armando's work is that a college campus is a very small community. And these students may not have known each other personally, but it's a very different feeling to be on a college campus and sharing that experience than it is, say, to be, even on the streets of a major city and having journalists from all over the world show up in, for example, Minneapolis and cover the events there. It's a different dynamic. It's a different responsibility and relationship that the student journalists at Northwestern have, especially being aware of the racial dynamics. So I think as both residents of Denver and Coloradans and people with a connection to the issues and the protests, that Nolan or Armando fall somewhere in that realm of community versus a journalist parachuting in from a big corporate newsroom and covering an event purely as news. So I'd love to hear more about how that resonated for them or how that played out. But now I believe we're going to hear about the legal. I deliberately stayed away from the law because that's Caroline's specialty. And I can't wait to hear what she's going to say about the legal aspects of this.
Yeah, thank you. I'm hearing little, resonances of things you'll hear more about in my presentation in each of your comments. So I think this is going to be a really rich discussion when we get done. So I'm going to share my screen. And obviously, the law is not ethics. I think to your point, Angie, you mentioned the response of the newspaper being perceived as Gen X to boomers, ruling the sort of the atmosphere, and that's kind of what you have in the law, right? That's what the law is driven by, is the older, richer, more resourced communities. And then you have younger voices that are coming up that are really pushing against those more or less black and white, but never black and white rules of society with these ethical considerations. And that's how we move legal society forward. So just a quick disclaimer, I'm a lawyer, but these slides are general and they are not intended to relate to any specific circumstance. And you should always get legal advice if you have a specific question. And in the legal arena, basically what we're talking about when you're considering protesters and the impact of putting their face out there, what's implicated in the law is the right to privacy. So I'm going to get into that, but I wanted to kind of shave the edges of that. Like there are a lot of other legal issues out there that aren't really as impacted as much by this protest issue. So we're not talking about defamation. Private rights to privacy don't care whether or not what is in the image is true or untrue. If there is somebody that is publishing information about a protester that is untrue, that's covered under defamation law.
Okay, so defamation is something that's a lie, but it's not necessarily something that's just negative.
Correct. Yeah, okay. It's the truth is defense to defamation, and the defamatory statement also has to have some sort of actual negative impact on the reputation of the person. So that's outside of the realm of what rights of privacy cover. And rights of privacy don't care about the intention of the photographer. There's not a question of, was there malicious intent when I published this photo of a photographer? Publish a photo of a protester in Charlottesville. That issue sometimes comes up in the case of famous subjects of photographs, but for the most part, these protest photos are members of the community. So we're not really getting into that. We also often hear of rights of privacy in the realm of criminal law, like searches and seizures. Like I have a right to privacy and the police can't come in and just root through my stuff. That's a separate right of privacy than this is a civil right that I'm going to be diving into. And also to say that there are statutes and specific laws that cover rights of privacy, things like HIPAA and things like data privacy statutes. So there are specific laws that cover narrow portions of privacy, but none of those really talk about the types of images and issues that we're talking about here. And then just as a final just sort of blanket statement, and to underscore it, is the press, whether that's a big newsletter, a big newspaper, or an independent freelance press member, they don't really have different First Amendment rights than the general public. there's not a subsection of privacy rights that only applies to the press. So when we're talking about rights of privacy, this is the same analysis whether you're a member of the press or whether you're just a Denver resident out with your photograph and you want to put something up on your website. So with that said, rights of privacy and publicity, there's really 4 different categories for it. And the idea behind these laws is the underlying human right to be let alone. And I'll get into these a little bit more depth, but the 4 categories are that there's a breach of your right of privacy when there's an intrusion upon your solitude or seclusion, when there's public disclosure of private facts about you, when you're held forth in a false light, and when somebody misappropriates your name or your likeness. And I'll tell you more about what those all mean. But the main takeaway is there's really 4 categories of ways that people's rights of privacy can be infringed upon. So the history of rights of privacy, this is a fairly new idea. It didn't come from England. There's not a whole lot of case law about it. It was first floated as an idea by some leaders in legal thought and jurisprudence in the 1890s. And it was a response to what was happening in the media, that the media was really being unfair to individuals and causing a lot of anguish and distress in the way they were just abusing their role. And so it was further developed during that time period to cover those 4 categories. You know, there was a lot of legal thought around, well, we should have rights of privacy, and these are the ways that we can describe it in these 4 different categories. And then the states slowly started to adopt rights of privacy slowly. It is an area of law that is not, there aren't many statutes. It's mostly governed by case law, so common law. And so each state has different ways that they handle it. They have different history in the types of cases and decisions they've had, and that includes Colorado. Colorado did not adopt the rights of privacy until the 1970s. So this is a relatively new concept in Colorado. So some ideas, some examples of how these rights of privacy have been treated in Colorado and the 10th Circuit, which is the federal district that Colorado is part of. So the first important case in Colorado was in 1997 I'm going to back up because there was a string of cases that talked about unreasonable intrusion. And so in Colorado, it's been held that it's an unreasonable intrusion of somebody's privacy to be opening their mail or, you know, breaking into their home and rooting through their belongings. Even harassing behavior is a breach of that right, and eavesdropping, using devices to eavesdrop, that's an invasion of people's privacy. And then in 1997, Colorado started to develop this idea that even the disclosure of private facts about people was going to be a breach of privacy. In 1997, one of the seminal cases in Colorado involved a homosexual lawyer, and he worked at a large law firm, and he had an AIDS scare. And so in open disclosure, he went to HR and said, I'm dealing with this, you know, I've had interaction with people in the firm, and the news spread like wildfire in the firm. Everybody knew, and he was terminated, and he sued the firm for disclosing private facts that were just horribly embarrassing in basically a public forum, and he won. Then 2002 in Colorado, we get to a case which is this is the image in the middle is not the image from the case, but it's very similar. So Denver newspaper ran a story that the headline was Denver's biggest crime family. And they had this big family tree and everybody's photos with it. And somebody in the family said, I've like got misdemeanors and I'm not involved in this family enterprise of crime. Like you have held me out in a false light. And if you remember, that's one of the 4 categories of rights of privacy. And the Colorado Supreme Court said, no, in Colorado, we're not going to adopt that one category of rights of privacy. And what the Colorado Supreme Court said was that it's very close to defamation already. You know, it's got that false element. You can already bring a defamation case. And I think that it was really important in the opinion, the court said that the false light claims raise a specter of what they call chilling effect on First Amendment freedoms. So you're starting to hear the court talk about this tension that Armando, you talked about, like, I'm here to record history and there's a reason that people need this information. But I also have this perspective of an artist and my right to freedom of speech and First Amendment rights. And so the court is starting to recognize that tension and saying that if we allow people to bring right of privacy action for no false light, it's going to chill people's right to freedom of speech, to get this information out to the public. And the court said, although we as readers or viewers of the news sometimes regret excesses or empathize with individuals whose unfortunate plights are exploited, we nonetheless heavily rely upon open and full disclosure. So that tension hasn't really gone away in what we're talking about right now. It's still that tension between, you know, a right for the community to know what's going on and what are the rights of the individuals whose horrible plights are being exploited. And then we get to 2003 in Colorado, and there's a court case that the court makes a decision that the private diary of a public official is not going to be subject to a Freedom of Information Act request. And the court said that it would be difficult to imagine anything other than a personal journal being more indicative of what is a private fact about somebody. So they sort of continue to expand, well, what are these private facts that we're going to protect and give people a right to sue those who publish them? So a personal diary has been recognized in Colorado. So then going back to this idea of, again, in Colorado, now we don't have false light. So in Colorado, we have the right to be let alone, and the intrusion upon solitude is going to give you a claim for an invasion of privacy, and a public disclosure of private facts also. So really 2, and we're going to get to publicity in a second. Just hold the thought on that because it's a little different analysis. But where that privacy and First Amendment right really start to grind together is that the courts have said that where there is a public interest or where the facts are already in the public record, there won't be any right to an invasion of privacy. So if you're a photographer and you're taking photos of a protest, and as Nolan said, you know, it's important for the community to know what's going on, those are matters of public interest in the eyes of the court. And the subjects of your photograph are no longer going to have that right of privacy protection. If they are in a public place, no rights to privacy in this context. And then if you have a photograph that maybe the police have and they've released it to the media, like a video shot from a bank, even though this is to publish a photo of a suspected bank robber is a horrible invasion and saying something horrible about that person, that's not going to be an invasion of privacy because it's already in the public record. As long as you've received that in a legal manner. So other ways that the court has sort of defined this area is to say, there are cases in other jurisdictions that says when you're marching in parades out in the public, no privacy right. If you are frequenting, let's say a bar that's frequented by white supremacists, you're out in public, no right to privacy, no right to stop the photograph going to publication. Being named in online media, that's out in the public record and no right to privacy on that. So just a couple other really quick, interesting cases about the rights of the press to express themselves and have that First Amendment freedom. There was a 1991 sporting case where there was a photograph taken at a public, I think it was a high school level sporting event, and there was a wardrobe malfunction, and they decided to publish the photo. Very embarrassing, was that ethical? We'll talk about that in a minute. But the court said, no, this was a public event and probably of some public interest, and that trumps the privacy rights of the individual who is out there in the public. In 2015, there was a Texas case. A journalism professor was present at a student sort of tent village that was related to a protest. And this is a photo of her telling the photographer, you need to leave, no photographs, get out of here. That got published. And the court said, no, this happened in a public arena. It's of public interest, and the photographers have a right to be there and to record this and to publish. So one thing that I would say is, there were a couple photographs that were shown in Angie's series of images from inside a building. So once you start moving photographs into a public building, not every space within that building, even if it's a governmental building, is considered to be public. So once you move out of that town square element, you have to start getting really careful about what you think is public and what's not. And then just a quick note on doxing, because that's a huge concern for people to have their face out there and what the social ramifications are of being identified. And in Colorado, we really kind of rely on anti-harassment statutes and anti-stalking statutes to protect against bad behavior of people who are just really kind of taking information too far. But we do not have any sort of doxing law in Colorado. There's a law that just, I think 2 weeks ago, came out of committee in Colorado that starts to address doxing in a statutory framework, but it's very limited application. It would only apply to health workers, law enforcement officers, and the Department of Corrections. Federal law isn't much better. The law very often trails very far behind ethics. So federal law, again, some protection for very limited categories of people, grand juries and informants. They get protection from being doxxed. Nobody else does. Nobody else has a privacy right if they have a photograph that they don't want shown that was taken at a protest. Okay, so really quickly, rights of publicity, that comes under the privacy umbrella, but it's really tied to commercial uses of images. So right of publicity is an individual's right to limit how their face or their name or their voice is used in conjunction with a commercial endeavor. So this is a photo. Arnold Schwarzenegger sued because he didn't get permission to have this bobblehead made of him, and that was a commercial endeavor. So it's settled, but that's the type of thing that arises under the umbrella of the rights of publicity. But then there's this really interesting area, right? Like the press and media have a profit motive. Photographers like Nolan have usually some sort of profit motive to sell their photographs as a freelancer or sell their photographs on the website. So when does something become commercial enough that, oh my God, now I might be treading on somebody's rights of publicity? And there is guidance from the courts that relates to a case that raised the question in the context of news media. And the court has said that a profit motive does not transform a publication of a legitimate matter of public concern into commercial speech. So if it's legitimately public concern, you don't fall under this umbrella. Nobody has a right of publicity if there is a legitimate matter of public concern. And then the court said that many news publishers, including newspapers and magazines, are motivated by their desire to make a profit. Courts have repeatedly held that in order to be actionable, the use of a plaintiff's identity must be more directly commercial than simply being printed in a periodical that operates for profit. So I think that there's some guidance there also toward, a photographer making a living that happens to have a subject as part of that mode of profit motive. And then since you're with a gallery, I thought I'd just touch on this really briefly. This is a photograph of this artist named Richard Prince. He's very famous in copyright circles as sort of pushing the envelope of what is fair use and what's not. In this particular case, I don't think there was anything that examined the rights of privacy issues, but I thought it was an interesting case study because he had gallery exhibitions where he literally just took people's Instagram photos, blew them up, and put them on a wall as a statement on today's society. And of course, they were curated to have a particular viewpoint, but certainly if you are, and these people did not give him permission, so certainly if you have an Instagram account and suddenly there is somebody trying to make a profit off of just copying your Instagram, that would feel like an invasion of your privacy. And I just offer that for conversation also. The court didn't address it, so I'll stop talking now. But I'm very interested to hear Nolan and Armando's perspective on what their initial concerns were when they were talking about exhibiting certain images. And
I mean, it's interesting. Yeah, go ahead.
I just didn't I didn't know if it was legal or not to show a clear photo of someone's face. And then also I didn't really have a problem with showing that because it was what happened. But when it came to putting a price on it, that's when I got a little more uncomfortable with it. And then I figured that might be illegal, but I don't know. Is it illegal to do that? Or?
No, because you've taken an image where not only is there an event of public concern, but people are in a public arena, and your First Amendment rights to express yourself through your photography has been held to trump that. Yeah. And I've been seeing a lot of comments of photographers that have sort of leaned toward this idea of, well, let's start blurring images as a best practice and barring out eyes, and that really impacts the power and the ability for your voice and your editorial perspective to push change.
Yeah, that's actually interesting point. Last summer, there was more of a sense of anonymity because everybody was wearing masks, so a lot of people's faces were covered. And so, but I was very mindful about doxing when I shared images of vehicles and their license plates. It's super easy to find people's information just by typing in a license plate. I came to realize that a couple years ago. And so I was very mindful of that. I don't know if you're, Angie, I know you did the case study for Northwestern. I don't know if are familiar with the case of Edward Crawford from Ferguson, Missouri.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he was photographed during the protests down there in 2014, after the killing of Michael Brown at the hands of Ferguson PD. And there was very tense riots and protests that were happening down there in the weeks and months following the release of the body cam footage. And in the certain photo, Mr. Crawford was photographed throwing a smoke canister back at police. And
it's a stunning photo too.
Amazing. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful photo.
It's artful, and it was one of the most impactful images. So I want you to finish the story because it's important what happens, but yeah, I mean, I would have hated it had it not been published.
Truly,
because it was one of the most so
powerful photos of this century. And so he was photographed throwing his canister back at police, and the photographer Robert Cohen, he ended up winning a Pulitzer Prize, not just for that photo, but his work with I think the Post-Dispatch which is the paper down in Ferguson. He was, he won a Pulitzer Prize. His career flourished after that photo. And 3 years after that photo was taken, the subject in that photo, Edward Crawford, ended up dying. He ended up losing his life under suspicious circumstances. And a handful of protesters from those protests in Ferguson also lost their lives under suspicious circumstances. And so that's always been something that's been in the back of my mind when I decide to share certain images, is can I, how would I be able to live with that? I'm sure that's something that photographer Robert Cohen has asked himself, over the years since that young man passed away. And as a journalist, that's just something that he has to live with. There's that, like you guys, like everybody was talking about earlier, there's that, old school journalism style of thinking where everything's objective and down the line. But as far as, I'm concerned, I'm there to also be a part of the protest and to lend my support to those protesters. So I try to be mindful of, what images I show, even though, I share some on my website or on my social media. I may not be so inclined to do the same thing in a public gallery, even if it's just because of the the price tag thing, as Nolan was saying. The images that I chose to share with Brandy and the Firehouse Art Center were images where you couldn't really make out of anybody's face. And ultimately there were images that were compelling to me, and as an artist I feel like I should have the say to which photos I share, display, print, and frame for a public space.
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's all everything you guys said is so fascinating.
Yeah, there's a big difference between.
I have so many notes.
Yeah,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just, what Armando was saying is there's a big difference between something being strictly legal and, maybe outing somebody in the commission of a crime that's going to have a huge impact on them. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. I was wondering how, I've photographed I've never photographed a protest, but I have photographed events. And so I know it can be kind of a rapid, you're just walking around trying to find your shot. But I've always wondered, one of the things they tell you is try and go get people's names or have them sign a waiver of stuff, like it's like a photo release, just so you have their name, you can contact them if you need to. And I can't imagine how logistically that would even begin to work at a protest. And it's interesting, like it was something that I was taught in school forever ago. Like, this is what you should be doing. And it's interesting, no one's even mentioned it, this idea that there could be a way to sort of maintain a contact with the subject of that photo, and that there might be like an element of trust and a relationship there.
For sure. I think, you know, when I go out in a photographic protest, a lot of times, you know, I take portrait style photos of people. So they're looking into the camera, or, you know, kind of posing in a way. And they're aware that I'm taking the photo. And a lot of the times it's because I approach them and ask them if I can take that photo.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that's super important, because if they, you know, if they're okay with it, then, you know, ultimately it was their decision to be photographed, and I let them know, you know, like this might be on social media, this might be on my website. A lot of times I give, you know, I have business cards that I give out, but in those moments where it's not a portrait, or it's something like really candid, you know, I have photos of people that were throwing rocks at the federal courthouse last summer, breaking glass. Like, I have photos of people in motion with like tattoos showing. That is stuff that I didn't want to share in these public spaces, in these public forums, especially on social media, where, you know, it's just so easy for something to go viral and spread like wildfire. You know, if that ultimately led to the arrest of somebody, or if that person was hurt in any kind of way, you know, that would be on me, I feel, even though it was in a public space. And I do have that right legally to photograph it. It's just one of those things that I just don't feel comfortable doing. And you know, things have changed over time, because 6 years ago, when I was photographing the protest here in Denver, in response to what happened in Ferguson, Missouri, you know, I wasn't thinking about that. I was looking to get the shot. I was looking to get something, you know, that would make an impact and tell a story. And so, you know, it's all part of the learning process. I mean, this is why I kind of agreed to be a part of this, because, you know, to learn from Caroline and Angie, because I'm not a professional. You know, I don't work for the New York Times or the Denver Post, or, you know, whatever. I'm doing this because I love to create, and I love to take photos, and I love to support certain causes. So yeah, you know, it's all up to the individual, I guess, the individual photographer and how they feel.
Yeah, there is definitely a back and forth between, and I know that maybe legally this isn't established, because like Caroline was saying, it takes a really long time for like cases to catch up to the law, or to the ethics, like general ideas of what's right and wrong. But to me, it sort of starts to feel like this idea of ownership of an image kind of goes back and forth between, like, I own my own image, like my face, or does the photographer own the work that they've produced, the photograph? Like, who really like controls that and has the right to control it? And I think that's a lot of what's shifting potentially culturally. Like, how would you guys, am I making stuff up? Am I frozen now?
I think that's exactly what's at the root of that tension between rights of privacy and First Amendment. You just said it in a more artistic and straightforward way. You know,
Okay.
like, that's the tension. Yeah.
I think,
and it's always been there.
I think with in terms of the practice of journalism, when I worked protests, and again, it was I stopped doing that around 2007. I think the last group of protests were around if you remember the Sensenbrenner bill on immigration, and how people were protesting against these very just kind of poorly informed laws about undocumented immigrants. And usually I would tag team with a photojournalist, and we would try to engage everybody who was photographed. And obviously this doesn't really happen well when people are being tear gassed or when things are out of control. But for the most part, we tried to maintain this practice of engaging people as they were being photographed and interviewed, because it was always nice to have an interview with a photograph and to have that implicit consent, and to also get to know the people and not just be documenting. And so it was also the idea of, could we stay in touch with the people who were organizing the protest or coming out protesting, and be covering them before the protest and after the protest, right? Because protesters usually don't just show up out of the blue. They're usually groups that have been organizing for a long time, who have wanted press coverage, who have their own stories and their own lives, and that doesn't end after the protest. So it's sort of being present in the community and understanding these groups and forming relationships, so that you're not just parachuting in, and the first time they've seen you is not when you're pointing a camera or a notebook or a microphone in their face. And I really encourage my students to do that on their own campuses, because I feel the Northwestern situation could have been avoided if the students at the Daily Northwestern knew more of the students who had protested sessions, if there were relationships between them, and if they had written stories about the students who were protesting the child separation at the border or anti-DACA policies. And I see there's Nate has a hand up, so I want to give him a chance to chime in. Yeah.
In the chat, or actually, what do? He wrote a thing in the chat, and it just says the identity of the Capitol rioters were found out through photographs. Or do we want to let Nate ask his question?
Oh, yeah.
Hey, there he is.
Yeah. If I can ask, that'd be great. Yeah, that was just in a comment to what Armando was saying earlier, that he was kind of concerned about people finding out the identity of these people that were throwing rocks or whatever. So I was just saying that, yeah, that is a valid concern. People were photographed to the Capitol, and their identities were found out because they were photographed. If there wasn't photographers there, then probably a lot of those people who riot in the Capitol would have, never been found. But my question is, when you're photographing a protest or in a public space in general, and someone says to you, don't take my photograph, say you're taking a wide shot of let's just say, Statue of Liberty or something, and somebody's in front of it, and they turn to you kind of angrily and say, don't take my photograph. I mean, the law is on your side as a photographer in a public place. You can take that photograph, So occasionally, if something like that comes up, I'll say, I'm in a public space. I'm taking a photo in a public space. They say, hey, man, don't take my photograph. I mean, these type of situations, you can lawfully take the photograph, but some people are so adamant about it, but the law is not on their side. I mean, they have there's no justification. They can call the police and say, this guy was taking my photograph in a public place. And in fact, something like that did happen to me once, and the police just walks on by. I mean, you know what I mean? So it's just, I guess what I'm saying is do you have any tips on dealing with people that are insistent that you're breaking the law when you are not breaking the law? Or people that are insistent on being angry at you for taking their photograph in a public place when it's completely legal?
Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this question. If somebody doesn't want you to take their picture, why don't you just wait until they leave or not take their picture? Like, if your goal is to photograph that monument, then you don't have to take that person's photo.
Yeah. That's one example. But let's just say we're at a protest or something, or some other event. You want to take a photo of the people that are there. You want to just show that the crowd or whatever. Say it's a wide shot of a crowd, and
Sure.
You want that photo. I mean, you're not breaking the law. And I guess what I'm saying is there any tips on trying to explain to people who are insistent that you are breaking the law that you aren't. I mean, should you carry a card that has the First Amendment on it and show them and say, look, this is what I'm doing is completely lawful. I'm in a public place, taking a photo in a public place. This is absolutely lawful. There's nothing you can there's nothing at all wrong with taking a photo in a public place. So I don't know. That's all I'm asking is people are insistent. Yeah.
I guess one tip I would have is if I took a photo of somebody and they were two times bigger than me and could take me in a fight, then I probably will respect their wishes and not take their photo. But for the most part, I haven't had to face or deal with that. Like I said, most of the time I confront people and I say, hey, can I take a photo? And more times than not, they're more than happy to oblige me. But in the cases where somebody said no, I don't want to take my photo, I'm quick to respect their wishes. I don't want a confrontation. That's not what I'm there to do. I can always get a similar photo somewhere else, in a different, choose a different angle. So yeah, for the most part though, I haven't really had to deal with that.
Yeah, me neither, really. I think it would depend on the moment though. I mean, if it was like a really important moment that you felt you needed to get a picture of, then you might push back a bit more. But if it's just, just a crowd shot, then probably not worth the confrontation, I guess. I don't know. But yeah,
well, I mean, the thing is, if you really want there I am. Oh, somebody stopped my video. I guess somebody's trying to cut me off.
Sorry.
Oh, sorry.
My bad.
There it is.
I was looking at my option. I'm sorry.
Okay. No problem. Yeah. I mean, I think Armando's right. I mean, if people are going to get violent, obviously you have to stop it at that point. But I guess just talking strictly in the law, I mean, if they say don't take my photo, you can still take their photo. They are in a public place. So at some point, the law is on your side on this.
Yeah,
so anyway,
I mean, it's the same kind of, we see this in all different areas, right? Like it is legal to require somebody to wear a mask when they come into your business, and people throw fits about it all the time. And you as an individual or that person as a business owner gets to make their own decision about how they're going to treat the situation, what they think the PR flack may be, what they think the storm of social media outrage is, what the ramifications of that coming out might be. There are lots of, while things are not necessarily illegal, there are still ways for disgruntled subjects to have their opinions known, and is that going to impact you? Is that going to tarnish your reputation as an, does it matter to you if you're an ethical photographer? Is it an ethics question?
I would say from a journalistic perspective, if you've already entered into a confrontation where somebody is saying, don't take my picture, it's not going to be a good picture unless the point of it, like the Melissa Click photo at the university protest, the point of that photo is to show her being outraged about the photography. That was a story in and of itself. But if you're in a protest situation and somebody has already confronted you, you're not getting an organic picture of what's happening at the protest. They're focused on you. And, rule number one of photojournalism is that if you're documenting an event, you don't want the photo to be about the photojournalist. If you're capturing a portrait like Armando has, then it's not going to be a very good portrait, right? It won't really be about what they're doing at the protest or their beliefs. It's about their being upset about you. So beyond legality, I think I would just ask, at this point, is the cost benefit analysis of capturing this image worth continuing this confrontation? Because it's no longer, from a journalistic perspective, a good situation of documentation unless the story is about people not wanting to be photographed.
And
So
then
that's, I think that's how I would approach it.
and then that argument is just taking your time from being able to take the next pictures that you could be taking if you like turned around and went in a different direction.
Yeah. But the advice I had given just about getting to know people before the protest or having a relationship or engaging, that was really important to me as a reporter and with the photojournalists I teamed up with, where when we were working in a community where we knew that certain issues were likely to lead to protests, that we made an effort just to be out there and meet the community leaders. And then in a protest situation, they would say before things got heated, hey, this is Angie and so, and they're working on the protest today. And just to have that endorsement from a community member, particularly when your identity is not the same as the people who are protesting for any reason, that's becomes doubly important. And so it's not always possible. It's not always going to happen in like, you know, the heat of like tear gas and conflict, but it can help avoid those situations too.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think definitely having that connection with the people that are, you know, organizing the protest or people that, you know, I go to protests and I know 30, 40 people there, you know, just because of the relationships that we built outside of that. And it you know, it doesn't even just apply to just like photography at a protest. You know, I'm involved here in the community in Denver, just like in the lowrider community, and you know, just spending that time with them and getting to know them over time makes for even just better photos. They trust you more. They know that you're not going to misrepresent them or their cause. So yeah, I think that's super important, especially in a protest. Is just like having those connections and building and nurturing those relationships over time.
One of the most important critiques I took to heart when covering protests was when somebody at the protest said, "Where were you before this protest? Where were you before it reached the level of us taking to the streets? You didn't ask us about this issue prior to the time we started marching in the streets." And I think as a reporter, I took that really personally because I said, yes, I should have been there. I should have been there when unfair legislation was being passed or proposed. I should have been there when police were killing people unjustly before it took people taking to the streets. Brandy, are we getting any questions
I'm looking.
on?
Well, we don't have any more in the chat here. We have a comment on Facebook again about the kind of like the social media messaging that surrounded like, hey, if you're going to a protest, like make sure you cover your face. Like don't bring your ID with you to protect yourself as a participant in a protest. And I think that had something to do with the ubiquity of like social media photography. And I've always found that warning particularly troubling because I feel like there's nothing illegal about joining a protest. Like you're not doing something wrong just by being there. So that if you can be identified being there, then, you know, what are you worried about? And the fear is that the potential repercussions from law enforcement are like shady and terrible. And so I kind of wanted to ask, you know, as a journalist, as participants in social movements and from the perspective of the law, like how would you respond to somebody who says like, don't bring your ID to a protest? What is that? What do you guys think?
I could add a wrinkle to that. I don't know if this is answering or like just adding another question, is that I think there's also, you know, I've seen among my friend groups that it's not only the police, which yes, like shady stuff, but other opposing political groups of people that see that picture and then get involved in the doxing. And now you are defending your ability to make a living because they've hunted you down ruthlessly or are calling in threats to your house or whatever they've decided to do. So there's there may be legal defenses against the police, but when there's this shadow of social movement on the other side of the political spectrum, that's really hard to fight against.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if if other people share that observation, that it's not just fear of the police, or if that's something I picked up within.
Yeah.
For sure.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, there's definitely the other side that will try to use an image or a video to, solidify their political position or whatever. But, I guess to Brandy's question, I've never been one to be like, hey, I'm not going to bring my ID. I feel like if I was to get into a conversation with law enforcement and I didn't have my ID on me, I'd be worse off. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think it's for there's definitely different factions that attend these protests. There's people that are there for the right reasons. There's people that are there for the wrong reasons. There's people that are there to document and be journalists. But I think if you're going there with the intention to, purposefully agitate, and go around, breaking windows or starting fires or whatever, then maybe not having an ID with you is a good idea. I don't know. I tend to lean the other way, and if I get stopped by the police, I want to have my proper identification on me for sure.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. You guys,
I know there were situations. Sorry.
Go ahead. Sorry, don't mind.
Just quickly, there were situations in not so much in the Black Lives Matter protests, but in the Capitol insurrection and Trump rallies where journalists felt safer covering their media credentials because it made them vulnerable. And I know that's not exactly equivalent, but that just to note at it's been a unique era in which media were explicitly targeted in various events, riots, protests, and that hasn't happened quite in the way that it has in the recent years. Perhaps the change of administration will change things, but it really raised the awareness of reporters at events like that in realizing that they're uniquely vulnerable and have been targeted.
Yeah, there's an interesting back and forth there where, we acknowledge that no member of the press or many members of the press are just not going to be neutral. They can't be entirely neutral. Oh, thanks, Nate. Happy to. Yeah, so we talked about that more members of the press are acting, kind of from a different perspective in the younger generations. And then, so how do you then, there's an interesting switch in how you maintain a trust in a press that begins to acknowledge that there are certain issues in which, like, the individuals themselves cannot be entirely neutral. And I think that's probably what the older generation is so worried about. Like, how do we maintain our, fourth estate status? If third estate, is it third or fourth? I don't know. How do we fourth? Oh, good. Okay. How do we maintain that sense of respectability, right? Like, if we begin to acknowledge that we're individuals with individual experiences and perspectives. And so I think that's super fascinating. It's going to be interesting to see the next little while.
Yeah.
How would you training, right? Education,
transparency.
Oh, yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I prefer transparency over objectivity because I don't know if objectivity's ever been possible. And one of the things that I appreciate about Nolan and Armando's work and their presentations is they were both very transparent about their positions and their familiarity and their like entering into the protests in the ways that they did. And I think that documentary photographers, art photographers have actually pioneered that space of being more embodied and more present in their work than journalists have, who have always been taught to be totally invisible and neutral. And I'm not sure it's certainly not possible in the current day and age, but I'm not sure that was ever really possible.
I think there's a lot of looking at history and sort of realizing like all the big picture skim part of this story is not all that's there. So yeah, I think thank you.
I'm curious, it sort of prompted a question, as the face of journalism is changing and there's more freelance and big media conglomerates are shrinking. And I always think of things, you know, as a litigator and a legal person, when I'm working with a client, the question is always like, how can you afford to even defend this? And I would think that you're moving from a situation where you have large newspapers who can put resources toward defending journalists on maintaining that line of First Amendment. And I wonder, Angie, if you think that that's going to get affected. And
for sure, it already is. I think even the phenomenon of doxing and the attacks through social media, there have been journalists who've moved out of their homes, who have been swatted, who had to hire private security. And if they work for a big organization, say like the Washington Post, then the Washington Post clearly has the money to pay for that. If you're a freelance journalist, you're probably not going to be able to hire private security or go live somewhere else until you feel safe. And so it's a serious issue as journalism fragments and you have a lot of very small kind of grassroots type media organizations or nonprofit media organizations that can't protect their staff the way that big corporations can. And I don't know the answer, because they're equally at risk or more at risk, even if they don't have all these security measures.
Yeah. Just hope the ACLU picks up their cases, I guess.
Yeah. And then, I didn't even get into like legal cases. And then I would expand that out also to protesters who get attacked on social media too. They're probably not in a position to have these kinds of measures that I just mentioned that big corporations have taken. But yeah, I personally know journalists who were moved out of their homes temporarily by their newspapers or their media companies for their protection. But that's a big expense. And yeah.
But there's an interesting thing too, because we keep kind of talking about the photographer's free speech in taking the photograph, but there's also like the subject's free speech in like being at a protest that could then be potentially kind of twisted against them in exactly what you're saying, like the doxing and in professional ways. I don't know, one that comes to mind, and I'm terrible about this, but I read an article recently that there's a case coming up soon or kind of is in front of the Supreme Court where a high school cheerleader like tweeted a bunch of curse words about cheer and she was suspended from the team. And so the case is that, you know, like as a kid, does she have free speech that like the school can't come after her if she's like off campus, if she's somewhere else entirely, and that has repercussions for like everyone. Like if you're at a protest and you say or do something that's recorded, can your job then, you know, like do something to you? I think that those cases coming out are going to be really interesting.
Definitely. Yeah.
And it's kind of,
I don't have any, I'm not familiar with that case, so I can't even give any feedback on that, but that's super interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, she was on Twitter and she was like, F cheer, I hate this today. Like, and they were like, well, fine, don't come back.
Yeah.
So like,
Right.
wait, that's just,
Yeah. So
right. So it's very interesting because then that potentially like affects, you know, if you're at a protest and you talk about like, you know, some decision that a corporation made, like a union activity movement, or, you know, like, can your job then come after you because you have an idea that's different?
Well, yeah, there is a really pretty well-developed line of cases around the ability for employers to terminate you for your exercise of free speech. And there's different criteria that apply, like whether or not you were, so a lot of the cases are like political candidates who were oppressed at work or terminated because they were out on the political road making their viewpoints known. And then there's all these criteria about, like, you know, were they engaging in free speech, like in your example, on or off the job, on or off school. That's a factor. You know, I don't know them all off the top of my head, but there is a pretty well developed line for employers not being able to discriminate based on First Amendment activities, political speech. Yeah.
Interesting. But you think about that, like, as someone documenting those activities, like, how responsible am I to this subject? And I really appreciate all of you guys talking to us about this. I don't have more questions from our Facebook or Zoom audience, but if you guys have any questions for each other since we're here, and anything we didn't cover that we should have?
We dug into my questions. I've loved this conversation.
Yeah. I just want to express appreciation for Armando and Nolan for documenting such important events. And I just want to give props, Nolan, your picture of the protester putting out the fire really moved me when I looked it up on your website, because that story wasn't being told in mainstream media. Yeah. And it's a really small act. It's a small fire in a small little bottle, but it really said a lot. And so just props to you for, like, you know, giving that story and that image some airtime.
Yeah.
Right after that happened, actually, there was people that were angry at those guys for putting out the fire, and like almost started a fight with them just for putting out the fire that these other guys started. But it's crazy.
Yeah.
And that's a story too.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely appreciated and was grateful that you had images to share, and really lovely and moving work, and just telling that story so well in getting up close and personal, and not just having wide shots of unidentifiable spaces. That's where the value of journalistic photographers lies, is looking that person that could be your neighbor in the eye during this, you know, very tumultuous time through the lens.
Yeah, Robert Capa, I don't know if you guys know him, but his famous quote is, if your photos are good enough, they're probably not close enough, or something. So I like that. I like
that.
Yeah.
Oh, wait, you guys, I have someone with a question. Sorry, there's an educator from our Front Range Community College who's watching our Facebook Live and just texted me that he wants to ask a question but can't find the thing. So I'm like, just tell me, what do you want to know? We're right here. What do you got? Shout out, John.
Is he a photo professor or something?
He manages the art department, so he oversees the photo professors and fine arts. We didn't even get into, because this has definitely been journalism heavy, which is great. But when you translate all of that work into fine art, so many of the rules just get thrown out the window, because, like, in fine art, you can almost do whatever you want, but it is historically more artists build relationships with those subjects that they have like are more long-term. There's definitely been a transition from you know, like Diane Arbus. You guys know Diane Arbus, right? Like she's really well known for okay, she's really well known for taking pictures of people that she just kind of met once but have very specific visual attributes, like a giant or dwarves. Or she would go to like the circus and just drop in and take some pictures and leave. And she would get names. She would kind of get to know people enough to make them comfortable. But people are really reevaluating her work in terms of like, how ethical was this really? Like these pictures are striking. They're famous. They're fantastic. But how high should we hold these in esteem? Gosh, there is another photographer whose name is Mary Ellen Mark, who did a 40-year-long project where she really built like a personal relationship with this woman who was a prostitute as a teenager in like the 70s. And she would go and photograph where she lived and what she was doing and how she was doing, like over the course of 40 years. And so it's very interesting to compare and contrast like the impact and the legacy of both of those projects. Mary Ellen Mark is becoming more and more respected as an artist, like almost exponentially, because people are starting to really appreciate the ethics of building that relationship and trust and respecting that person. So
I think it's, you know, we have such a expanding definition of consent these days, and it's all part of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So John was like, oh, I don't have a specific question. I just want to know how to do it. I just worked my way through that and now we're good.
Awesome.
So if he comes up with something, that's fine. But yeah, so yeah, I don't know. And I really, honestly, really enjoy that you guys were generous enough to let us show your photographs in a fine art setting as part of a story. So thank you for that too.
Yeah, thank you for having us. And Caroline and Angie, thank you for sharing your expertise. Definitely learned a lot. So I really appreciate that.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks for inviting me. I have loved this. This has been a great evening.
I'm going to think of questions in the middle of the night that are going to wake me up and you guys are going to get.
You could email them to us.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Just email. Yeah. We will put the video recording of this chat on our YouTube channel for the Firehouse. I don't know whose video we have right now. So yeah, so we'll put this on our YouTube channel for the Firehouse and then have it for posterity. So thanks, guys.
Will that be okay for us to share and share links to? And okay.
Absolutely.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
Yeah.
On a snowy night in
absolutely
in Colorado. You didn't have to like drive in the snow. So one good thing about doing this on Zoom.
Oh, we have some more thank you comments. Yeah, thanks to you guys.
Yeah. Thanks for coming.
Awesome.
So
well, have a great night, everybody.
You too.
Hey, you guys too.
Bye.
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 Bye.